Hey folks, Dr. Sparkle here, alive and well, believe it or not. And yeah, it's been a long time since I put up a new episode of Chrontendo, and there was a long delay on the episode before that. And the sad thing is, I actually had a lot of work done on episode 48 when the last one was uploaded, and I planned out a timeline as to how long it would take me to finish episode 48 and work on the new Chron Turbo and Chron Sega. And of course, absolutely none of that happened. Now, I don't really want to go too much into the details of my personal life and give you excuses and that sort of thing, but looking back now, well, I actually did take a new position at work that allowed me to work from home, and quite frankly, I thought having an extra hour or so a day not spent commuting back and forth to work would give me extra time to do things like work on Chrontendo. But in fact, that didn't really work out. My scheduled work hours are now much later in the day, and with my old work schedule, I'd actually have a bit of time after work, before my wife got home, to sort of do things like this. Now working later in the day, I pretty much need to start making dinner or have to go to the store or something immediately after I get off work. And due to various health issues with my wife's family, she has less time to commit to helping me with that sort of thing. So pretty much by the time we're done with dinner and the dishes and all that crap, it's pretty late at night, and I really have had a lot of difficulty finding time to sort of squeeze in for Chrontendo. And also, there is unfortunately sort of a snowball effect when you get really behind on something. Once it becomes so late, it somehow becomes harder to finish, and that final 10% takes longer than the first 90%. I don't know why. So bottom line is I've been having to put some serious thought into how I schedule my time. It's for some reason just more difficult now than it was a year ago. And in order to find time for Chrontendo, I'm going to have to be more disciplined, I guess. I actually also have a couple new projects coming up. But that said, Chron Sega and Chron Turbo will always take less time than the Nintendo stuff. So those episodes will obviously not take 8 months or however long it's been I've been working on this one. And also I kind of hope that working on some of these new projects between episodes of Chrontendo will buy me a bit of extra sanity, sort of flush out all the mental poisons that happen when you work on Chrontendo, sort of a mental enema, if you will. So episode 48 has another 15 games, most of which are not very good. But we do have some weird shit here, including that crazy Capcom game based on a movie that I mentioned last time. And of course the 1989 Arcade Roundup, which is just so goddamn long. So let's get started. Okay, let's start the new episode with RoboCop, a game based on the classic 1987 Paul Verhoeven action movie, which, as I'm sure you recall, was about a cop who gets killed by mobsters and brought back to life as a sort of robot Jesus. Now, this sounds pretty good, right? Well, by now, you should actually know better. The opening screen shows that this was licensed from Ochin Software, a Mancunian video game publisher noted for putting out tons and tons of licensed crap, and who years later eventually got folded into the Atari brand. Naturally, Data East released this in the United States, virtually unchanged, using the same name, RoboCop. Crime on Nash Avenue. Is there even a Nash Avenue in Detroit? Apparently this game takes place in Ypsilanti. For some reason, despite RoboCop being a 7-foot-tall, heavily armed cyborg, everyone in the neighborhood seems to want to attack him while unarmed. Naturally, RoboCop can simply dispatch these dudes with a single punch, but Dr. Sparkle, you say, he's got a gun, why doesn't he shoot people? Well, the game does not actually let you choose when to use the gun. RoboCop will automatically pull out his gun in certain areas and holster it in others. See, here we go. RoboCop is a port of Data East's 1980 arcade game and looks very similar to the arcade original. Now, the arcade RoboCop was not terribly good. It was a pretty simple walk-and-gun game, miles behind something like Contra in terms of sophistication and fun. But you might be asking, if the home game was based on Data East's arcade game, why was it licensed from Ochin? Well, apparently Ochin bought the video game rights to RoboCop even before the movie was made. So Data East had to obtain the rights from Ochin, and then, of course, Ochin ported the arcade game to various computers, such as the Commodore 64, the Spectrum, The Speccy version somehow received massive critical and popular acclaim in England. I guess it's kind of like the Ocarina of Time for the Spectrum or something like that. It was #1 on the Spectrum sales charts for a full year and a half. Here's the first boss. No idea who it is or what this guy is supposed to be. The fight is kind of odd, because he can't be harmed by your gun, so you might think, well, how do I kill this guy? But as soon as you get within punching range, you stop using your gun and just start hitting him instead, which does eventually kill him. But there's actually no way of knowing this until you get right up close to the guy. RoboCop also looks really stupid when he talks, like his tongue is sticking out. Now you have two life bar things. Your power is like your regular life bar. It shrinks as you take damage. T is time, I believe. It slowly ticks down, and when it's empty, your batteries run out, which is pretty stupid when you think about it. I mean, RoboCop having these batteries that just die and leave him powerless after a few hours or whatever. But the display is pretty weird. Under functions, for example, is where you see RoboCop's face. That flashes when there is a destructible wall nearby. Not that you would ever guess that just by looking at the icon. As the game progresses, you'll see that it sort of follows the movie's plot, but there's really not much here in terms of any kind of storyline. RoboCop is not an utterly awful game, but it's certainly nowhere near as cool as you would hope it would be. Okay, for our last Japanese game of August 1989, we get into a rather obscure genre, the world of mini Yonku racing games. So from Konami, we have Mini Racer Yonku, Japan Cup. Notice the credit to Tamiya on the title screen. This demo screen shows some of the different types of races we have here. Fall down, pretty radical. Okay, so what is Mini Yonku? Well, it's also known as Mini 4-wheel drive. It involves racing these little tiny but very fast motorized toy cars. Kind of like RC cars, but you have no type of steering or control mechanism. It was more or less created by the Japanese model company Tamiya in the mid-1980s, and became quite popular in Japan. This game is an officially authorized Tamiya tie-in, so their logo appears in-game, and I assume names of the actual car models were used. I guess I have to give Konami a certain amount of credit. Rather than making a standard racing game, they made it sort of like this weird board game with racing elements. As you'll recall, we've seen several Game of Life style video game board games, and it's actually quite similar to that sort of thing. You take turns rolling dice, or in this case, it's more like spinning a roulette wheel. You move around the board, making money or losing money, all with these rather charming animations. So here's the thing about the whole Mini Yonku hobby. Buying the car is just the beginning. The cars you buy off the shelf are pretty crappy, so you need to start customizing it. You need to purchase all kinds of upgraded bumpers and wheels and whatnot to make your car go faster. So as a result, the game very much revolves around buying car parts, even more than in most racing games of this time. Improved parts for almost everything can be purchased. So here's the weird thing, the races themselves are completely automatic as far as I can tell. You can't control your vehicle at all, just like in real-life Mini Yonku cars. Clearly, Konami and Tamiya are engaging in some kind of interesting cross-branding synergy here. And those of you who are not into Mini Yonku racing, which I'm pretty sure is just about every single one of you, will not get much out of this game. Nor do I really understand the mechanics of this, despite having absolutely no idea what I was doing. I somehow came up first. Is this scripted? I'm not even really sure. Will you always win this race? The game is for multiple players, so I'm not even sure exactly how this is supposed to work. Anyway, it's a rather strange game. Now before moving on to September, we've got exactly one US only game to look at. Alrighty then, we have but a single US-only game today from August 1989, Jordan vs. Bird, 1-on-1, published by Milton Bradley, but copyrighted to Electronic Arts. Oh holy hell, what is this? What is going on here? Oh goddamn, that's ugly. This is a crudely done 8-bit conversion of the 1-on-1 Jordan vs. Bird box art photo. Someone just traced the photo and drew out a pixelated version. But what happened to Jordan's shirt? This is just a bit more proof that Rare simply did not give one shit when it came to all the for-hire work they were producing at the time. And yes, as you may have noticed on the credit screen, this was ported by Rare, who had done all of the previous Milton Bradley NES games. Jordan vs. Bird was a sequel to the pioneering computer basketball game 1-on-1 Dr. J vs. Larry Bird, originally released in 1983 by EA. It was one of the very first sports games to officially use the names and likenesses of big-name sports stars. The sequel, Jordan vs. Bird, came out on computers in 1988. It had much improved graphics, but didn't really have the following of the first game, which people just loved to death when it came out. Now, as far as I can gather, critical reception was pretty lukewarm to this game. At least the original computer version. It's not bad, but nothing special. It just doesn't really live up to the names of the guys on the cover. So clearly, when it came to porting this, Rare made some compromises. The audience had been removed and a brick wall put in its place. The game is simple 1-on-1 basketball. It's not that hard to get the ball in the basket, but defense is tricky. Stealing the ball just doesn't seem to happen that much, and I didn't figure out how to effectively get the ball after a rebound. Now of course there are penalties for traveling, blocking, charging, which seem to be handed out in a rather arbitrary fashion. It's really kind of hard to say what triggers a foul. I once got traveling in mid-jump. Aside from the 1-on-1 part, there are these dunking contests and 3-point shot contests. There's nothing too interesting here. The slam dunks have all have these cool names, but it's really just a matter of holding down the button at exactly the right time. Even the concept of Jordan vs. Bird is a little weird. Those guys were sort of from different eras of basketball. I mean, too bad they didn't make a Magic Johnson vs. Bird game. That would have made more sense because they were actually sort of considered to be rivals during the mid-80s. Anyway, that's Jordan vs. Bird, and with that we wrap up August 1989. Well, that's some pretty jaunty theme music. This is Tecmo's Gekito Pro Wrestling, Tokon Densetsu, the first game of September '89, and the only game released in the first 2 weeks of September. I'm not sure why, but September is a really bottom-heavy month, with about 6 games coming out on the 29th alone. You get your standard collection of wrestlers, many of which are inspired by real-life wrestlers in a non-infringing sort of way. The first guy here is naturally based on Antonio Inoki. This guy is based on a fictional wrestler called Tiger Mask, who's actually a manga character in the late 60s and early 70s. Tiger Mask became sort of an archetypal wrestling figure, and he does turn up in several wrestling games. Now it's kind of odd, when checking the game on Hardcore Gaming 101, they stated this character's name is Christ Hyper, and I thought, wow, that's a pretty bizarre name. Yet, in-game, the character is referred to as Warisu Hyper. Now, Hypa is definitely hyper, but Warisu? I have no idea. I checked the spelling of Christ in Japanese, and the standard form is Kirisu. So sadly, I don't think this guy is really called Christ Hyper. However, you should still definitely check out the Hardcore Gaming 101 article on this game, as they show the character illustrations from the manual, which are actually quite cute and goofy. In spring of 1990, Tecmo released it in the US as Tecmo World Wrestling, putting the company's name in the title as they do with like Tecmo Bowl and various other sports games. The game is virtually unchanged in the US version, other than the names being altered and some of the characters getting new artwork. There are these little mini games where you can increase your strength through exercising. It's just a quick little button mashing thing, but doing well does give you a bit of an edge in the actual matches themselves. It play is very similar to the other wrestling games we've seen like Nintendo's Pro Wrestling, or over on our sister series, Chrontendo, Human's Fire Pro Wrestling. You can punch and kick by using the A and B buttons, and when you get up close to your opponent you can execute a number of grapple moves and throws. The object being to wear down your opponent's stamina and then pin him. The one truly novel feature here is the constant commentary from the announcer, who in the US gets a pretty ugly makeover. He enthusiastically describes the actions as it's happening, but the funny thing is it's kind of difficult to read what he's saying while you're playing the game, because you're busy focusing on what you're doing rather than reading the stuff at the bottom of the screen. I'm thinking that Tecmo, knowing that these games are often played in groups of more than two, put in the commentary in order to give some entertainment value to the kids when it wasn't actually their turn. The other cool feature is that Tecmo World Wrestling has these cinematic cutscenes when you perform a special move. This is sort of like the slam dunk animations found in basketball games at the time, though Tecmo gives them a certain amount of Ninja Gaiden-esque cinematic flair. Another interesting and sort of annoying addition is that your opponent, once his health is down really low, starts cheating like crazy. Suddenly he starts hammering you with aggressive attacks one after the other. All in all, it's a pretty good wrestling game, though not Tecmo's most successful sports game, by a long shot. In Japan it doesn't seem very well remembered, belonging to that special class of Famicom games that don't have their own Japanese Wikipedia page. I don't really believe that Tecmo ever followed up with a sequel, despite putting out tons and tons of other sports games over the next few years. Next up is a game from our good friends Tawachiki, the guys from those goofy Sherlock Holmes games. You might remember that first one where every pedestrian in London went around shooting guns randomly for no reason. And they also did that horrible Garfield game from episode 44. However, Idle Hakkenden is a hell of a lot better than those games, because it was developed by Natsumi, who are of course mostly known for the Harvest Moon games. This was a very early Natsumi title, the second we've seen on Chrontendo, and even at this early age, they were producing some pretty high quality work, at least in terms of graphics and music. So we get this charming as all heck intro here, which is actually going to be the most interesting part of this game for the viewers, because Idle Hakkenden is yet another goddamn menu-based adventure game. Now, the extremely literate among you will have already taken note of the name Idle Hakkenden and realized it was a play on Nanso Satomi Hakkenden, the 19th century Japanese epic novel, whose English name is sometimes rendered as Eight Dog Chronicles. We've already seen games based on Nanso Satomi Hakkenden, but this one is a bit different. It concerns 8 young ladies, but the character you play is named Erica. The other 7 girls will appear at various times. One of them, Hoshimi, this lady here, serves as kind of your sidekick. In almost every detective adventure game you have some kind of sidekick who follows you around and you can ask them questions and that sort of thing. Hoshimi fills the role here. And of course in the game the other 7 girls make appearances as well. There's a nerdy scientist type girl, a motorcycle gang girl, and so on. As in all these type of games, you need to talk to various people, move to various locations, get items. Some of the items I found while playing this included a candy and a ticket to the aquarium. At some point you're going to need to enter that aquarium and sing a song to a sea otter. There's a few times in this game where you'll sing a song, the result being this brief musical interlude. Altogether there are 6 songs in Idle Hakkenden. Now, Japanese Wikipedia considers Idol Hakkenden to be sort of a follow-up to the first Natsume game we covered, Toho Kinbun Roku, which was a crazy-ass, time-traveling adventure game involving Marco Polo. We covered that back in Chrontendo 37, and which also had some musical digressions. Apparently, Natsume was sort of developing a house style when it came to these adventure games. Now, unfortunately, we'll only be seeing one more Toachiki game in Chrontendo, but plenty of Natsume games, and hopefully they'll be a bit more exciting than this. Well, we've got two games from the record label Pony Canyon today, and they are about as different as two games can possibly be. First up is Tanigawa Koji no Shogi Shinan 3, which is obviously the third game in the Shogi learning series that bears the name of Koji Tanigawa, the Shogi Master. Though the first game of this series was never released for the Famicom. No, it was an MSX game. Shogi Shinan 2 was released for the FDS, and now the third game gets a regular old cartridge release. No idea who developed this, but it's a pretty standard looking shogi game. You have regular head-to-head shogi versus the computer or versus another person. Shogi is of course an Asian game that's actually close related to chess, though the rules are a bit different. And there are a few other options here. You can watch sort of a pre-recorded shogi match. This is supposed to give you tips for your strategy in playing shogi. There's also a couple odd variations on shogi, like this one where you play but with all the same pieces. Or even stranger, there's a slot machine version in which you use a slot machine thing to choose which pieces you can move that turn. I guess '89 was a pretty good year for Tanigawa. Aside from this game coming out, he actually won the big Shogi Grandmaster Tournament again. But he wouldn't win that tournament another time until 8 years later, and there wouldn't be another Koji Tanigawa video game until the PlayStation 2 era. So this is actually the last game that we'll see from him in Chrontendo. We have some genuinely strange games today, but here's one that blows my mind. From Capcom, it's Marusa no Onna, a menu-based adventure game, and this is certainly not the first adventure game we've seen from Capcom. Samurai Sword came out in late 1988, but that one had sort of a typical fantasy theme to it. Marusa no Onna is quite a bit different. Now, we've seen video games based on comics, on animated TV shows, on live-action TV shows, on movies. Most of the Famicom games licensed from films are some kind of action or science fiction movie, something that younger people would be familiar with. But far and away the unlikeliest source I've seen for a game so far in Chrontendo is this one here. Marusa no Onna, the 1987 international hit movie by Juzo Itami. Its English language title is A Taxing Woman. Now, the director Itami was becoming a huge film sensation in Japan in the mid-1980s. His 1984 movie, The Funeral, won all kinds of awards. He followed up The Funeral with another movie called Tampopo, and after that, A Taxing Woman. In the US, in the 80s, these three movies were probably the most well-known Japanese films by a contemporary director, or maybe actually the only well-known films by a contemporary Japanese director. They used to show them all the time on cable TV. Thing is, A Taxing Woman is a completely adult film. It's an art house black comedy about a middle-aged female tax collector, played by the director's wife. She goes after businesses who are cheating on their taxes. And off the top of my head, I really can't think of a less likely candidate for a video game adaptation. Can you imagine playing an NES game about a tax fraud investigation? The US equivalent would be, I don't know, maybe Hannah and Her Sisters, the video game. One strange thing is that the box art uses the artwork from the poster for the sequel, Marusa no Onna 2. So despite its odd subject matter, Marusa no Onna plays out just like every other Japanese menu-based adventure game. You have the standard menu options: move, look, speak, examine, use, and the last command is others, sort of a miscellaneous command. I guess the structure more or less conforms to other detective-type adventure games, even though you're not really technically speaking a detective. Instead of trying to solve a murder, you're trying to catch people committing tax fraud. The game starts out with you in your office, where you talk to your boss, log into a computer, real exciting stuff. Once you exit the office, you can move around on the streets and travel to various locations. This is usually done by entering the train station, then taking the train to some other part of town. Your first destination is the pachinko parlor. So essentially here you talk to folks, get information, then head back to your office, look up some stuff on the computer, and then head out elsewhere. Interactions tend to be the typical repeated use of the look and talk commands. While sometimes you find an interesting item, or you need to use the examine command, the odd thing is I don't really think this is a straight adaptation of the movie, most of which is concerned with the unusual relationship that develops between the tax investigator and a hotel owner who she's investigating for tax fraud. The hotel owner appears in the game as a character, as do several other people from the movie, but I don't recall a pachinko parlor or anything like that, so I don't think this is actually an adaptation of the film. It might be sort of like an original story based on the characters. So earlier we were wondering why Capcom made a game based on such a strange movie for a video game. Perhaps they were aiming for a more mature, non-gaming audience? But also, this movie was massively successful and critically acclaimed. As were Itami's movies in general at this time. A Taxing Woman won 9 Japanese Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Screenplay, Best Actor, Best Actress, Best Supporting Actor, and his earlier movie The Funeral did pretty much the same thing a couple years earlier. In fact, I think about just every Itami film of this era earned multiple Japanese Academy Awards and nominations. So Itami was just such a huge presence that somehow one of his movies got made into a video game. Interestingly enough, we'll actually see another Itami-related game later in 1989. Itami was an actor before he became a director, and Capcom made a game out of a movie he acted in called Sweet Home. And this game is actually much more well known in the West than Marusa no Onna, and we'll be covering it a few episodes down the road. And going back to a much more standard subject for a video game, we have Ultima, Seisha Hino Michi, the second Ultima port for the Famicom, created originally by Richard Garriott, as that super brief intro screen there says, but published by a record label company, Pony Canyon. Some would-be epic-sounding music here, which is unique to this version because the original computer version had no music at all. A rather obscure company called Softhand may have had something to do with the music. Ultima is one of those games where the behind-the-scenes stuff is a bit confusing. This is the second Ultima port from Pony Canyon, the first being Ultima 3 in 1987. Just like that game, Ultima Seisha Hino Michi got a US release by FCI, which was another branch of that huge media company that also contained Pony Canyon and Fuji TV. In 1989, these guys were so rich and powerful they actually hired Ronald Reagan, who had just left the White House, to come to Japan and basically give a bunch of speeches saying how great they were. So if they could acquire him, certainly acquiring the NES rights for Ultima was no big deal. The official release title of the US version was Ultima Quest of the Avatar, naturally, since Quest of the Avatar was the subtitle of the original US computer version. Now there is some kind of story going on here. You run into a magical Renaissance festival and get teleported to Britannia by a fortune teller. This is pretty much what passed for a plot in 1980s RPGs. Ultima 4 goes about character creation a little bit differently than most Western RPGs. You don't directly choose your class, and you can't play as different races. There's no elves or dwarves here. Instead, you answer some questions about your personal values, and then get assigned to a particular character. There are the typical fighter, paladin, mage, but also some more off-the-wall stuff like shepherd or tinker. I don't know if this is the first game to use this form of character creation, but it certainly was unusual at the time. Which character you play as will decide which city you start off at. This part's a little confusing, since you exit Lord Britain's castle and end up outside, but the building that you see there is not the castle you just exited. Somehow, the moment you step outside the castle gates, you instantaneously get teleported halfway around the world and end up outside your hometown. So that little town you see there is actually Jellin, the hometown of the fighters. So you might be like, whoa, where'd the castle go? Where am I? Each character's hometown is devoted to a particular virtue. Jellin is devoted to valor, and everyone is a fighter, just like I am here. Kinda weird when you think about it. I mean, what happens to the guys who aren't into valor? Does the town kick them out or kill them? So there's a town full of mages, one full of paladins, and so on. Inside you have your typical Ultima shops. There's a tavern, inn, various NPCs who will drop cryptic hints about where certain things are located. Another feature here is you will often find NPCs hiding in corners and slightly inaccessible places, so snooping around the town is vital. Obviously, Dragon Quest used this idea as well. Ultima 4 was originally released on the Apple II around Christmas 1985, at the same time the NES was being test marketed in New York City, and slightly prior to Dragon Quest being released on the Famicom. Afterwards, it was ported to many other computer systems, and for years was considered to be perhaps one of the best computer games ever created. It was sort of like the equivalent of Dragon Quest III for Western RPGs. But it was far bigger, more involved, had more characters and dialogue than all the earlier Ultima games. It was sort of considered to be the game where RPGs grew up. Instead of simply revolving around killing off the evil wizard at the bottom of the dungeon, Ultima 4 was about creating a whole world and a culture for you to explore. In fact, the game was considered revolutionary at the time since the main objective didn't involve defeating some kind of evil final boss. There is no final boss in Ultima 4. Though in practice, this doesn't really change things much about the game. I mean, it's the same old run around and kill monsters, and get money and experience, better weapons, explore dungeons, etc. In most RPGs, you reach the end of the final dungeon and then battle some kind of evil wizard or monster or something and save the universe. Here, you reach the end of the final dungeon and then you won. That's it. Game over. Congratulations, you're the Avatar. And being the Avatar means that you're a very moral person, despite having killed tons and tons of creatures throughout the game. But that's okay, you can kill and still be virtuous because you're only killing, bad guys. Also, looting the corpses is okay if you've killed someone, but stealing from living people is bad. So yeah, I guess Quest for the Avatar totally teaches some important moral lessons, like kill all the witnesses. You guys ever notice how every RPG takes place in a hold your ground state? Some games will even penalize you from backing away from violent confrontations, like you will lose money or something like that. Video games do teach valuable life lessons, like making sure that every fight that you get into ends in violent death. Combat is a lot like Ultima 3. You enter this special combat screen, and each side takes turn performing actions. But characters who do not have targeted weapons or magic must actually step towards the enemy until they're adjacent, then attack. Frequently, you're just moving your character one step per turn. That actually will often take longer than the actual fighting part. Thus, ranged weapons and spells are very handy. Another way this differs from Japanese RPGs like Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy is your hit points. In those games, you always start out with like 5 hit points and will usually level up after 2 battles. And you have to be really careful at the beginning of the game because it's so easy to get killed. So you'll do a bit of fighting and then healing and then so on until you're strong enough to venture out into the next town. Well, in Ultima, I started out with 300 HP. I fought battle after battle and never had to even remotely worry about dying. And leveling up is something that requires traveling all the way to Lord Britain's castle, So there's none of this sort of constant improvement and progression that you see in JRPGs. So what exactly do you do in Ultima? How do you play the game? Well, it sort of boils down to a bunch of fetch quests, technically. First of all, you need to find some other party members. In each town you'll find a recruitable character. As I mentioned earlier, each town is populated by a specific class. So for example, you can recruit a druid in Yu, a tinker in Minok, and so on. Some classes are certainly more useful than others. Aside from getting your 4 party members together, you'll need to grind for cash and get some decent weapons, especially bows for ranged attacks. And then it's pretty much all about wandering the earth in search of stuff. Specifically, you need to find the 8 runes of virtue. That's a rune as in the letters of a Nordic alphabet. But in the game, these runes seem to be like some sort of stones, maybe with runes written on them or something. These are hidden about the various towns, others are squirreled away in harder to reach places. NPCs often drop hints about the location of this kind of stuff. You use these runes to unlock the 8 shrines of virtue. You then have to meditate, which does something, I forget what exactly. You also need to master the 8 virtues by performing, or sometimes not performing, certain actions. I mean, some are really easy. To increase valor, you just need to fight in lots of battles and not run away. To increase compassion, you need to give a gold piece to a beggar when you meet one. For humility, apparently you can just talk to lots of people. At some point you'll also need to venture into the dungeons and find each of the 8 stones of virtue, I guess to match the set of runes. You use the stones to get some keys, and you also need to get a bell, book, and candle, and once you've got all that crap, you can then enter the final dungeon. And you actually beat the game by being asked a quiz about the 8 virtues. So Ultima 4 is a pretty weird game. I mean, the whole idea of an RPG based on virtue was supposedly inspired by parents complaining about violence in video games. But it still involves a whole lot of killing, lots of random battles and stealing people's loot. And the structure is kind of weird as well. The world map is a huge sprawling place with the 8 towns mentioned, plus, a number of other locations. Travel is mostly done through these teleportation portals called moon gates. Essentially how this works is at a particular spot, a magical portal will briefly appear when the 2 moons are phased up correctly. When you're on the world map, you can see the moons in the upper left corner. You can only travel to certain locations from any given moon gate, so you may have to make several trips using moon gates to get to the place where you want to be. This is all pretty confusing, though in the US at least, the game came with a huge manual, like 80 pages, including this handy chart for using the moon gates. Also, there's some maps of the world and of individual towns, descriptions of weapons, armor, herbs, all kinds of tips. It's virtually a mini walkthrough guide. Other ways in which Ultima 4 is kind of strange. I mean, on one hand, it takes place on this huge world, full of NPCs and exploration, and is in many ways completely non-linear. On the other hand, it's very strangely structured. I mean, you go from city to city picking up party members and looking for some runes and stones. And there are dungeons, of course, but they're all connected together. And you'll probably have to level up quite a bit before you can even start exploring the dungeons. So most people who play it today will get all the runes and important items first while building up their virtue stats and grinding for gold and leveling up, and then going to the dungeons, getting those virtue stones, and finishing up the game. I mean, it's not like Dragon Quest III or Final Fantasy II or Mother or Phantasy Star 2 or any of those games where there's some kind of narrative structure that has new parts of the world opening up and becoming consecutively more difficult with dungeons and mini-bosses, each getting a bit more difficult as you progress through the game. I mean, in Final Fantasy II there's this tightly constructed narrative that's always driving you forward. Instead, here you can wander around wherever you want, but you sort of have to do the dungeons at the very end because it takes that long to get strong enough to survive the dungeons. So the game, like I said, does feel very strangely paced compared to most JRPGs. So let's take a look at the dungeons. Ultima 4 handles it in a pretty odd way. You actually enter them from Lord Britain's castle. Once you've found this key, which can only be purchased in a couple towns which are accessible by ship only, and the ships can only be obtained once you reach a certain level. So, as I pointed out earlier, it's impossible to actually get to the dungeons until you've reached that level. Dungeons are of course completely dark unless you use a torch or a spell, and you then go up or down a floor by using this annoying ladder interface. The first dungeon is pretty big, but you need to go all the way to the bottom floor in order to access all of it. Also, you'll find entrances to the other dungeons. Like I mentioned, they're all connected into some sort of super dungeon. and there's plenty of random encounters at this point, but nothing too tough. Now this is not a completely faithful port of the original. Part of the issue is due to hardware limitations. They had to cut out quite a bit of stuff from the computer version. The computer version was spread across multiple discs. The dialogue choices with NPCs have been greatly simplified and reduced to more standard JRPG talk options like you have in every other JRPG. Obviously, the ugly stick figures from the computer version have been converted into your typical squat little Dragon Quest guys. At one point, Ultima 4 was considered to be the crowning achievement of computer games, and even today some folks will still call it the greatest RPG ever made. More than likely, you'll probably enjoy something like Earthbound or Final Fantasy IV or Dragon Quest V more than Ultima 4, but we can't ignore its historical significance. I mean, if you're some kind of video game historian, you'll definitely need to investigate this particular game. We've not seen much from Taito lately, have we? They had a few games out earlier in the year, such as a port of Operation Wolf, and there was a baseball game a couple months ago, and then today we have yet another arcade port. This time it's the Chinese-themed horizontal shoot-'em-up Chuuka Taisen, known in the US as Cloudmaster, though this Famicom version never had a US release. What can we really say about this game that we haven't already said? It's a Gradius-inspired shooter, I guess. Though it has a completely different power-up system, it does sort of feel kind of like a lame Gradius knockoff. Those of you with strong memories will know this is the third time we've seen this game. It was mentioned very briefly in the 1988 Arcade Games Roundup, and the arcade game version was much nicer looking in terms of graphics and had better sound, and the backgrounds, inspired by Chinese painting, looked pretty good. Hardly a classic game though. And in Sega 8, we covered the Sega Master System port, which looked quite a bit uglier and didn't impress me very much when I discussed it back then. The Master System version was released sometime in 1989 and did not get a Japanese release since Sega had already pulled the plug on the Master System in Japan by that time. Now we have the Famicom game, which also looks pretty poopy. It was ported, I think, by something called Disco. According to Game Developer Research Institute, Disco was a subdivision of Taito originally created to sell appliances, but later the name was found in the credits of some Taito NES ports. If you need a refresher course on this game, well, you shoot waves of enemies such as soup bowls and turtles. Oh, and look, here's a mini-boss. Once you defeat him, you'll get to enter a shop of sorts. There's no money or anything in Chuuka Taisen. You simply get to pick one of the power-ups every time you enter a shop. This replaces your existing power-up. Aside from what you get in the shop, you can also power up your main weapon in a very non-spectacular fashion. Here's a 3-way shot, for example. At the end of the level, you'll fight a big boss. And that's about it. It's pretty short, a very basic shooter. I wasn't impressed with it when I covered it in Sega, and I'm certainly not impressed with it now. Well, we're almost through 1989, so I guess we better finally get around to doing the 1989 Arcade Roundup. Yep, after the video game crash and during the height of Nintendo Mania, arcade games were still huge. And while we were seeing the number of arcades in the US diminish, there were still tons of places to play these. Movie theaters, pizza joints, bowling alleys, miniature golf courses, and dedicated spots like Chuck E. Cheese and other amusement venues. So what kind of arcade games came out in 1989? Well, not a whole lot different from those in 1988. This era was around the height of the whole militarization era of video games. In the wake of the huge success of movies like Rambo and Top Gun, all kinds of games with similar themes were created. So in 1989 we had tons of Contra-esque running guns, as well as lots of shoot-'em-ups where you pilot as a jet fighter. The dominant genres at this time appear to be run and guns and their relative, the beat-'em-up. We're sort of at a golden age of beat-'em-ups here, the huge upswing in the genre being triggered by the success of Double Dragon. Also, shoot-'em-ups remain very popular as well, and there's also of course quite a few driving, sports, and puzzle-type games. Sega in many ways remains the king of the arcades, despite simultaneously supporting the Master System, Genesis, and preparing for the release of the Game Gear in 1990. They were actually putting out a pretty amazing amount of product when you think about it. Many of Sega's high-end arcade games of the last few years used their sprite scaling technology. Turbo Outrun was the first sequel to Sega's 1986 hit, and actually was sold as an Outrun conversion kit. It was on the old Outrun board. The course here is based on an actual map of the United States, with you traveling from coast to coast. Not terribly different than Outrun, vehicle upgrades have been added for one, but it's still a very nice looking game. Super Monaco GP was technically a more advanced racer, using Sega's X board, the same board used for Afterburner and Thunderblade. Way back around 1980, Sega released a couple top-down Monaco GP arcade games, so I suppose this is a very belated sequel. It has very nice use of carefully layered sprites and backgrounds to create a 3D feel. Line of Fire also uses the Sega X board. It's a military-themed rail shooter, which uses two mounted positional guns. Rather than a standard gallery shooter, something like Operation Wolf, this is more along the lines of Panzer Dragoon, in that the camera is constantly moving on a set of rails. In this case, you're driving in a Jeep, giving it sort of a Disneyland dark ride type of feel. Line of Fire really goes overboard with the explosions and flying objects and huge damage text popping up, making it feel sort of like one of the more frantic rail shooters that came out later in the 90s. Now, the System 24 board was its successor to Sega's famous System 16 boards, but wasn't really used in a ton of interesting games. Crackdown, aside from having this absolutely amazing intro, was a bit unusual for Sega. It featured two-player co-op with a separate mini-screen for each player. Your objective is to go around planting a set number of bombs to blow up an enemy base, and it feels kind of like a variation on Alien Syndrome. Now, much more well-known was the game that came out for the brand new System 18 board, Shadow Dancer, the sequel to 1987's Shinobi. Shadow Dancer doesn't really change the formula too much. You now have a dog companion that you can use to sick on enemies. Like Crackdown, the game revolved around bombs, in this case defusing them. Now, if you've ever played the Genesis game Shadow Dancer, you'll find the arcade version is pretty much a completely different game. This was also the last Shinobi arcade game. Moving a step back technologically, we have Sega's most beloved game of 1989, Golden Axe. I love the way the logo incorporates the shape of the weapons. Now, you choose among three characters, the classic sort of trio of slow but strong, fast and weak, or balanced. Golden Axe is very much one of the classic games of the post-Double Dragon beat-em-up era. Unlike many of Sega's earlier beat-em-ups, you can move in 2 dimensions instead of just one. You have a variety of attacks and even magic at your disposal. You can also kill mounted enemies and then hijack the rides. And you can also beat the shit out of elves. Totally top-notch stuff, and definitely one of the top games of 1989. Other Sega games of interest are E-SWAT, which is kind of like Shinobi with guns, but with a twist. It's a basic walk-and-shoot type game, feels pretty similar to RoboCop actually, and the story was lifted directly from RoboCop. Now, after killing 3 bosses, you will get the E-SWAT Robo Armor, which looks like it should turn you into a walking death machine, but is actually a little lame. Just like Shadow Dancer, it got a Genesis port, which completely redid the game. Now, Sega did put out a few sports games for arcades. Here's MVP Baseball, which is most notable for the goofy art style and unappealing character designs. To me, everything here looks sort of like it's in like the British or European comic art style, with those weird bug eyes and oddly shaped heads. It looks kind of like the guys from the Lemmings games or something like that. Also a bit obscure is Beirut, which was actually developed by Sunsoft. First of all, Beirut is one of the most boring video game names ever. It sounds like a driving game, but it's not. It's a straight-up Contra clone set in either some kind of post-apocalyptic wasteland or in some war zone that's been torn to pieces by airstrikes. The title screen also just mentions hostages, and it's so Contra-like that it actually has a spread shot weapon. Okay, so there's Sega for you, but what about the other big guns of the arcade scene? Well, Namco for one didn't really offer too much of interest in 1989. Burning Force has a great name, and a rather striking track screen. The game itself is a Space Harrier-like shooter with sprite-based 3D effects. It uses the Namco System 2 board, which was first introduced in 1987 with the racing game Final Lap. The System 2 could do various forms of sprite manipulation, but the effects here are nowhere near as spectacular as the stuff that Sega was doing at this time. Also of note is Namco's Valkyrie no Densetsu, a sequel to the Famicom game called Valkyrie no Boken, which we covered way back in Chrontendo episode 9. That was the same episode in which we covered Metroid. Now Namco does not hesitate to use the System 2's abilities as often as possible. Sprites are always shrinking and growing. The game is a pretty good combination of shooting, action, and RPG-like characteristics. NPCs will give you new abilities, chests will pop out loot, and you collect money whenever you kill something. We'll actually see this game later when it's ported to the PC Engine. Not quite as good as Marvel Land, a pretty simplistic platformer, but one which is actually pretty cute, and has some rather thumping music. A lot of other Namco games had this candy-colored, cutesy style at the time. Namco really didn't get quite into the whole military shooter thing, though they did have some shoot-ups, like Dangerous Seed, which had a rad logo, though the game itself is pretty similar to Dragon Spirit. You often find yourselves fighting giant spider things, or creepy little frogs and that sort of stuff. Later on there will be a Mega Drive port of this. Even less interesting is Blast Off, which is, quite frankly, one of the most generic looking shoot-em-ups I've ever seen. Technically it's a sequel to Bosconian, and it does have these sort of rather slick, clean looking graphics that feature some nice 3D-like effects, such as this rotating space station thing. But the game itself seems pretty boring. Now Taito, on the other hand, would go fully into the military shooter genre, in particular through their games developed by Toaplan. Twin Hawk is a fine example of this, sort of a successor to the 1987 game Flying Shark. You control a small, underpowered World War II-style plane engaging an entire army, with lots of tanks, even tank bosses. I found it to be pretty hard. Hellfire sounds like a World War II shooter, but it's actually more like a Gradius clone, though one with a much more normal power-up scheme, and rather unmemorable generic space station type backgrounds. This boss is just like the Gradius Shoot the Core boss, only he has 4 cores. Not a bad little game, but there's really not much here that's going to make it stand out from the crowd. For non-Toaplan games, let's take a look at Caddish. This is yet another attempt to introduce RPG elements into an arcade game. You get to choose your character class. I foolishly chose Mage, and then it's off to the side-scrolling RPG action. You have gold and experience, stats like strength and agility, all that stuff. Yet it is a very linear side-scrolling action game. Caddish is not bad by any means, but the whole idea of sort of converting a traditional arcade game into an RPG is one that a lot of games experimented with at this time, and the results were always interesting, but mostly not exceptional. Master of Weapon is a science fiction themed shoot 'em up. One bizarre coincidence is the date listed here is September 11th, 19XX. In this game you can find and shoot these big dual skyscrapers which collapse World Trade Center style. Other than that, it's really not very memorable, and it is sort of an ugly looking game, which, by the way, later got ported to the Genesis. Now Darius 2 is, well, it's a sequel to Darius, that big wide game that uses the crazy 3-screen cabinet. Now, most Darius 2 cabinets scale this back to a relatively modest 2 screens. Darius 2 is pretty much just like Darius 1 as far as I can tell. You shoot a bunch of spaceships that are shaped like fish. Also Battle Shark, a submarine first-person shooting game. Nice looking graphics, cool fish. Can't say the game is that great. Now take a good look at this because this one will never be ported to any 16-bit systems. Special Criminal Investigation is the sequel to Chase HQ. Pretty cool intro as you tear off in your fancy sports car to rescue some kidnapped victims. Why are people always getting kidnapped in video games? SCI is essentially just Spy Hunter done in the Outrun style. Ramming cars off the road, shooting rocket launchers, you know, that kind of stuff. Taito also released a number of relatively gentler games, such as the strangely named Camel Tree, in which you navigate a maze by revolving the world around you. Though I clearly did not have the controls emulated correctly here. Are there other arcade games based on this concept? I'm not sure. It's quite unusual. Ported to the Super Nintendo, by the way. Don Doko Don is a gentle little platformer, and while it's not a Bubble Bobble sequel technically, it's very much in the same vein, except that you smash things with mallets rather than capture them with bubbles. It was actually ported to the Famicom in 1990, and maybe due to the whole mushroom thing, got released as a bogus Mario game on pirate carts. And while we're here, let's check out another shooter that Toaplan made, which was perhaps not done for Taito, the famous Zero Wing. And this is actually, I'm not quite clear as to whether Taito released this or not. Some of the cabinets in the US say Williams on them, and I don't see Taito's name anywhere on this, so maybe Toaplan released it themselves in Japan. I'm not 100% sure. Now this is a cool little Gradius style shooter, and I'm sorry to disappoint you, but the cutscene that contains those famous lines of broken English do not exist in the arcade Zero Wing. Nope. That particular cutscene was created especially for the Mega Drive Genesis version. Obviously we'll encounter Zero Wing again in Chron Sega. Alright, let's check out some of the other companies. Data East released a slew of mostly forgotten action games. Vapor Trail Hyper Offense Formation has cool music. Not to be confused with the Rush album, of course. Vapor Trail is a pretty decent but not very original shooter where you blow up a bunch of tanks and enemy jet fighters. Oh look, here's the standard giant tank boss that so many games used. The awkwardly named Act Fancer Cybernetic Hyper Weapon is a horizontal shooter. What's with Data East and the word hyper? This one I think is pretty obscure, and I don't believe it ever got any sort of home port. Okay, now this is just silly. You're a spy named Agent 000, taking on the Council for World Domination. They're not very subtle about it, are they? There's a pretty cool beginning where you have sort of a mid-air shootout over Washington, D.C. Sly Spy is a rather colorful action game which is pretty fast-paced and tends to throw you from one set piece to another, in a fashion quite similar to the Uncharted games. For some reason it was ported to computer systems like the Commodore 64 and Amiga, but not for consoles. So, Fighting Fantasy is a pretty violent and weird fighting game with Mortal Kombat style plot. There's some wild fighting tournament going on where you battle a bunch of crazy monsters. It's a pretty dark and bloody game which employs some very simple fighting mechanics. It can barely even be called a fighting game in the Street Fighter sense. It also goes by the name Hippodrome, which is rather inappropriate since a hippodrome is a chariot racing stadium. Maybe they were confusing a hippodrome with a coliseum. Midnight Resistance has this insane intro. What does this mean? No idea. And then the game begins with you ghost riding off a jeep. That's pretty hyphy. Anyway, Midnight Resistance is a pretty cool little Contra knockoff. Guy with a headband and machine gun kills army dudes and tanks. Now moving on to more prestigious releases, we have Strider from Capcom. I'm not so sure Strider was a huge hit. It wasn't one of those games like Double Dragon or Street Fighter that you used to see in every single bowling alley with a huge crowd around it, but it does have a reputation as being one of the absolute best action games of the era. And it's easy to see why. It's fast-paced, tons of over-the-top action, utterly ridiculous bosses, creative level design. Strider is basically a non-stop roller coaster of a video game with fantastic graphics and sound. I mean, let's just look at this. These dudes become a giant snake. What the hell? And basically the whole game is kind of like this. Now obviously we've already seen the NES version of Strider, which was a completely different game. And I'd place Strider with Golden Axe as being the top 4 arcade games of this year. And another of the top 4 games of 1989 must be this one, Final Fight. 1989 through 1990 was sort of the golden age of beat-em-ups, and Final Fight is one of the absolute high points of the genre. Once again, we have a kidnapped girlfriend/daughter, and you need to walk across town and rescue her. Just like Golden Axe, there are 3 characters: strong, fast, and balanced. You have an attack button and a jump button, and a special move ability where you press both buttons at once. As you probably heard, Final Fight was originally supposed to be a sequel to Street Fighter. Guy, the balanced character here, is basically just Ryu in an orange outfit instead of a white one, aka Ken. And while the release of Street Fighter II in 1991 would pretty much wipe out the beat-em-up genre, for a couple years Final Fight and its ilk ruled the arcades. Now another interesting Capcom beat-up is Dynasty Wars. I probably should have mentioned this in the episode of Chrontendo where we covered Destiny of an Emperor, but this is the arcade game version of that game. In Japan, they both went by the same name, Tenchi Wokaru. Along with Strider, this was part of some multimedia plan Capcom had with a company called Motomiya Kikaku, a manga studio. Each property consists of a manga, an arcade game, and an original Famicom game. Unlike Strider, Tenchi Wokuro was an adaptation of an existing comic, not a new character. And basically it's just the 3 kingdoms. You can play as one of the 3 brothers, or Zhao Yun, who acted as a general under Liu Bei. There would be both an arcade sequel and a Famicom sequel later. Now Capcom's main shoot-'em-up series was the 1942 games, but here's another military-themed shooter from them, Area 88, or UN Squadron as was called in the US. The Japanese version was based on the Area 88 manga, and the weird thing was, Area 88 was actually one of the very first mangas to get an English release in the US. So the manga was actually available and readable in English in the United States in 1989, but they still released the game under a different name. Possibly this was a licensing issue. The Super Nintendo version is much better known and is considered to be one of the best shoot-'em-ups on that system. Okay, so what else do we have from Capcom? Well, there was Capcom Baseball, which went for the goofy cartoony style rather than aiming for a realistic baseball game style. Nothing too exciting here, I'm afraid. Konami was more known for its sports games than Capcom was, and they went the exact opposite approach with their baseball game Bottom of the Ninth, almost going for a photorealistic effect. Check out the animation on this. Were these traced from film footage of real-life baseball players? I mean, Konami is trying to make this look like a televised baseball game or something. Now, a few years later, they would revive Bottom of the Ninth as a game for the PlayStation and Nintendo 64. Now, I'll admit, Gradius 3 as a game sounds pretty intriguing, especially after the sheer awesomeness of Gradius 2, but this is actually a bit of a letdown. Gradius 3 isn't bad, it just sort of feels like more of the same. Like, instead of Fire Dragon, here's some Sand Dragons and Sand Lions. This rather famously was ported to the Super Nintendo, where it was one of the very earliest titles for that system, and was intended to show off the Super Nintendo's graphical muscle. After this, Konami sort of abandoned Gradius until the PlayStation era, or released the excellent game Gradius Gaiden in 1997. And again, looking back into the past instead of the future is Missing in Action, a sequel of sorts to Russian Attack. Now, back when we saw the home version of Russian Attack in Chrontendo, I liked it quite a bit. It was one of the best action games on the Famicom at that time. In the post-Contra era, however, it feels a little dull. I mean, if you saw this in the arcade next to Strider, you wouldn't have given it a second glance. Now, when you think of Konami in the early 90s, you might think of beat-em-ups, particularly those involving licensed characters. Now, here's one game that instantly springs to mind, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the arcade game. In the vein of Strider and Ninja Gaiden, TMNT existed as 2 separately developed games, one for the NES and one for the arcades. We of course already covered the NES version a few episodes back. Gigantic arcade cabinets that could accommodate 4 players were sort of becoming a more common sight in arcades at this time, and TMNT was one such game. A perfectly logical choice in this case, since there were 4 turtles. Now, this certainly was not the best beat-em-up game of 1989, but it came at just the right time as the Turtles were becoming massively popular. And in 1990, of course, we'd see the movie, and a flood of Ninja Turtles games were released over the next few years. Not as well known, for obvious reasons, is the rather bizarre Crime Fighters. classic over-the-top intro involving not a kidnapped girlfriend, but a whole bunch of ladies, captured by some crime boss. As such games go, it's just okay action-wise, but the appeal lies in it being so damned weird. You can attack enemies with straight razors. That's pretty cool, I guess. And then there's stuff like this. And lots of beating up punk rockers in the grimy streets of New York, I assume. I mean, just look at this. It's subtle, but the posters of the women on the subway are actually animated. Crime Fighters is bizarre enough to be worth a look, and actually ended up getting 2 sequels. Konami also put its finger into the puzzle game pie with Block Hole. Now, I love the idea of a fleet of Tetris-like blocks carving a path of death and destruction throughout the galaxy. And this sort of throws in shooting elements into the falling block genre. You need to fill in these shapes as they fall. I really don't think anybody remembers this game. Here's a puzzle game people do remember. It's the 90s, and there's time for Klax. Probably one of Atari's more successful arcade games at this time. Klax was very famously created by Mark Akers in a very short period of time, after he completed Escape from the Planet of the Robot Monsters, which had a very long development time. Some sources say the code was written in quote-unquote a few weeks, others give a more realistic sounding 4 months. Well, Klax, like Tetris, is an addictive little puzzle game that got ported to every system under the sun, including in 1990 the 2600, making it the last official Atari game for that console, even though various unlicensed games came out afterwards. Other games from Atari in 1989 included, well, Escape from the Planet of the Robot Monsters, of course. Great colorful intro here, sort of in the vein of 50s science fiction movies and Mars Attacks trading cards.
Your mission. Transport all hostages back to your ship. Destroy all robots. Rid Planet X of the evil Reptilon.
It's a cool little game, not much remembered today. Probably because I don't think it actually received any console ports, but instead several computer ports to the Commodore 64 and ZX Spectrum and that sort of thing. It's interesting, the graphics of the rescued hostages kind of remind me of those in Metal Slug. Some sources say that Atari's 3D Racer game, Hard Drivin', came out in 1989, but others say 1988, and I covered it in last year's Arcade Roundup. Another game released on the same hardware was Stun Runner, a futuristic racing game, almost kind of like a predecessor to F-Zero. Though Stun Runner of course uses polygonal 3D instead of sprites in Mode 7. Now obviously by 1989 standards this is utterly mind-blowing. It's just so damn fast and smooth looking. Sometimes Atari's high-tech experiments worked out, and other times, like in games like Pit Fighter, they didn't. Sorry SNK fans, but we're still 1 year away from the introduction of your stupid beloved Neo Geo. Instead, here's some crap SNK put out in 1989. Ikari 3 is a pretty weird game, and actually feels more like a top-down beat-em-up instead of a commando-style run-and-gun. We have some in-water Rambo clone on Rambo clone action here. As we see, SNK used much bigger, beefier sprites than in the prior 2 games. It's still a pretty ugly game and lacked any decent ports. And this was, of course, the final Ikari Warriors game. Alright, animal lovers, I bet you'll hate this game. Beastbusters is a zombie apocalypse-themed shooting gallery game. It also makes use of the very rare zombies with guns trope. Yep, the zombies are armed and quick on the draw. Also, dogs. Now I assume these are zombie dogs, not just random vicious dogs. Either way, you shoot a lot of dogs in this game. A whole lot of dogs. So dog lovers, beware. And also, SNK's glorious history of ripping off Capcom's fighting games begins here, with Street Smart, sort of a lame fighting game that resembles the first Street Fighter. It's not very good, but it has some nice details like the backgrounds and crowds, and of course the SNK ambulance that hauls away defeated opponents. Now this insane opening scene is from Gang Wars, which was developed by Alpha Denshi and manufactured by SNK, at least in some territories. It's a standard and pretty dull beat-em-up in the Double Dragon mode. Enemies constantly do this horrible sounding digitized laugh sound effect. It's really obnoxious. And the flyer featured an illustration of a guy who was obviously copied from a photo of Jackie Chan. Obviously this game has been pretty much long forgotten.
Hey, DJ boy, what you think you're doing?
Kaneko was a small game company mostly known for producing the Naughty Gal's Panic arcade games, as well as a few regular games like this one. It's a roller skating themed beat 'em up. You play the game on roller skates. Now obviously this makes it sort of feel a lot different than most beat 'em ups. Now does this take place in San Francisco? We have a marina, hills visible in the background, streetcars. Interesting. Now the most notorious moment is this boss fight right here. Also, this features the vocal talents of Wolfman Jack, for some reason. Somehow this ended up getting ported onto the Genesis. From Irem, we have Dragon Breed, a pretty sweet looking horizontal shoot 'em up in which you ride a dragon. The dragon itself appears to be indestructible, so you can use its body as a weapon of sorts. Seems like a pretty cool little game, never ported to any consoles, only computers. Now here we have X Multiply, not officially a sequel to R-Type, but sort of the spiritual successor to that game. Great looking title screen with creepy Suspiria-like music. And there's also that X and infinity symbol logo. That and the name itself greatly resemble that of the Yellow Magic Orchestra album X Multiples. So this is basically R-Type with a twist. Your ship has these crazy little arms. They resemble the Gradius style options, except they're attached to these arms and they move around as you move your ship. For example, moving backwards will cause the arms to move in front of you. Your little arms actually absorb enemy projectiles, of which there are a lot, so it's a pretty cool little mechanic. And despite not being very well known, X Multiply is actually one of Irem's better shooters. One that's much better than R-Type 2. Despite this cool intro, this game isn't quite as awesome as the first R-Type. Some sources say this was released in 1990, but MAME says 1989, so I'll go ahead and stick this into this year's roundup. It's hard to say exactly what's wrong with R-Type 2. It's competently made, but it sort of lacks the freshness of the first one. There's just really not that much new here. Just like Gradius 3, this got a port to the Super Nintendo a couple years down the road. Just a wee bit more obscure is Legend of Hero Tonma, which doesn't really resemble the Irem style at all. It's a cute little platformer, kind of like a Wonder Boy type game. This will turn up later on the PC Engine, and even got a US release on the TurboGrafx. The once mighty Midway was still plugging along. At this point they were more well known for pinball games rather than video games. One notable title this year was Arch Rivals, a cartoony looking basketball game that's mostly known now for being a dry run for NBA Jam. You have a variety of colorful characters you can pick, and the game has various animated mini-scenes, shattering backboards and that sort of thing. One of the very few games here today to be ported to the NES. Now Technos, despite having a massive recent hit with Double Dragon, didn't put that much out in 1989. A wrestling game, WWF Superstars. You might notice the Hulk Hogan is a trademark of Marvel Comics. That's right, Hulk Hogan actually had to license his name from Marvel Comics for quite some time. And this is obviously a fully licensed WWF game. Also, Blockout. This is an arcade version of a computer game. You know, there were actually two games that came out in 1989 that were basically Tetris in 3 dimensions. Weltris was created by Pajitnov himself, and Blockout was created by a couple of Polish guys. But hey, Tetris was hot, and since the right to that game were all completely tied up, Blockout was the next best thing, I assume. Hey, Sword and Sorcery fans, here's a game for you. Astyanax, aka Lord of King in Japan, from Jalico. And this was apparently developed by ICOM, the guys who worked on Legendary Axe for the TurboGrafx. And this looks and plays a lot like that game. In fact, I mentioned this similarity back when we covered Legendary Axe and Chronturbo. Pretty sweet game, but sadly it was never ported to any 16-bit systems, only getting an NES port. A Mega Fighter is an utterly generic shoot-'em-up from UPL. We saw the somewhat interesting Atomic Robo Kid from them last year, but this is a rather outdated-looking, bog-standard shooter. UPL would go out of business in a year or two, a victim of the contracting arcade game scene, though Tsutomu Fujisawa of UPL would end up forming a new company called Phil Plus. They're still active and co-developed Lost Odyssey, and did that No More Heroes sequel. They even did a lot of work on some Dreamcast games for Sega, including a notorious flop called Shenmue. Now here's a weird-ass looking game from Tecmo, Wild Fang, called Tecmo Knight in the US. That's original. I don't know what to say about this other than it looks sort of amateurish, but this is so ridiculously violent, gory, and over the top that I can actually forgive that. Wild Fang is it's a pretty obscure game. It was never ported anywhere as far as I know. This one's pretty weird, so I guess maybe give it a try. And last, but definitely least, oh by the way, here's a not safe for work alert. Turn off this video now if you're at work. Okay, it's Tokyo Gal from Nichibutsu. They had made some cool stuff like Crazy Climber in years past, but they eventually settled into stuff like this, sexy mahjong games, which is exactly what this is. And okay, we're finally done, until we reach the 1989 Computer Game Roundup. Oh god. But one big takeaway of all this is that very few of these games ended up getting NES or Famicom ports. In the last few years, games like Double Dragon and Ninja Gaiden and all kinds of things ended up on the world's most popular game console, and that is about to end. Almost everything here, with a few exceptions, that had a home version ended up on the Genesis, the TurboGrafx, or the Super Nintendo. The Nintendo Entertainment System as a delivery system for home console versions of arcade games was pretty much at an end at this point. Okay, now all this is over with, let's go back to where we left off. Alright, let's check out a few US only games for November. There are actually a lot of non-Japanese titles in November 1989, so we'll need to do some now and then some next time. Obviously, this is another one of those rare developed games. Once again, it's a game show adaptation, published by GameTech. At this point, we'll be seeing rare developed games about every single episode, and this will actually continue for a while. So clearly what we have here is a game version of Hollywood Squares, a daytime game show that I'm pretty sure is no longer on the air. The idea was that you play tic-tac-toe by having celebrities, or sort of C-list celebrities, answer questions and then trying to decide if they have the correct answer. Technically it existed up until the 2000s, but for me it's impossible to separate this from the golden era of game shows in the 70s and early 80s. It was sort of a sister show to the Match Game, and both of these feature this sort of particular brand of not exactly top-tier celebrities, whose claim to fame seemed to mostly stem from appearing on these game shows. For example, I have no idea what Charles Nelson Riley did other than the Match Game.
$500. Did Adam and Eve have a last name?
Ginsburg, I think. No, did Adam? No, they did not have a last name.
I agree with you, They did not have a last name. X gets the square and $500 in cash. All right.
The competitive aspect of these things was actually sort of a minor part of the appeal. It was mostly these goofy celebrity guests constantly making corny jokes. And if you check out episodes of these things back in the early 70s, you'll see it was pretty much the entertainment world's major source of gay actors who were not officially out of the closet, but were constantly making non-stop sexual innuendos. GameTech released multiple versions of the Hollywood Squares video game, starting with this one here, the Commodore 64 version from 1988. Then, of course, they hired Rare to produce a version for the Nintendo Entertainment System. While the graphics and characters and music have all been completely changed from the original computer versions, the basic idea remains the same. You pick a square, and then the person in that square asks a question, which they will reply first of all like a corny joke answer. Then they give you their real answer, and you need to decide whether it's true or false, or rather whether you agree or disagree with them. If you get the correct answer, then you put an X or O in that square. Now, GameTech did not license any of the likenesses of any of the celebrities associated with the TV shows, so this sort of destroys the entire appeal of Hollywood Squares. The entire focus of this show was watching guys like Paul Lynde be goofy for half an hour. Here all we have are like this hopelessly lame jokes and uninteresting trivia questions. Guess the best way to win this game is to play it a few times and start to memorize the answers. That's an obvious flaw in these sorts of things. Because of the very limited number of questions, someone who's already played it will have a big advantage against someone who hasn't. Anyway, there's very little of interest here. Let's move on to another Rare-related game. So again, we get the standard Rare credit screen, but this game doesn't even have a proper title screen, at least I can't find it. Instead, when we start, we go straight into the selection screen and get a charming little version of the Sesame Street theme song. As I recall, one of my main complaints about Sesame Street 123, High-Tech's first Sesame Street game, January 1989, was that it didn't use much music from the TV show. So here at least we get one memorable song. Now, of course, once you actually start the damn game, we find it's just some hastily done minigame collection with Sesame Street characters thrown in. Letter Go Round comprises 6 variations on the same game, in which you use a Ferris wheel to match letters. You simply press the button when the correct letter is on the bottom. Alright, so a Ferris wheel, which is not the same thing as a merry-go-round. You get a dark, starless night, the moon reflecting on a mirror-like lake, a circus midway. Again, what does this have to do with Sesame Street? Absolutely nothing. Anyway, if you get 3 correct, a character will appear and do a little dance. Here's Big Bird. Here's Cookie Monster and Ernie. Damn, Ernie's got some sick moves. Think that's some kind of industrial dance he's doing. Or here's Cookie Monster and Bert. And again, Bert is hella swag. The second and final game here, and yeah, that's right, there are exactly 2 minigames on this cartridge, that's a few less than the last High-Tech Sesame Street game, is Ernie's Big Splash. Now, despite the theme of the cart being the alphabet, the developers apparently couldn't come up with a second alphabet-themed game, and instead they did this thing. The object is simply to press the D-pad over and over until you get the box that points you in the direction you want to go, and then you add the next box on. You just sort of keep adding boxes until you connect Ernie. This game is pretty moronic and stupid. And just like that other Sesame Street game, while Rare's name appears on the credits, it was subcontracted to Zippo Games, which is a small English studio run by 2 brothers. As Game Developers Research Institute Riley puts it, the studio folded due to quote-unquote Rare not paying them much. We'll see a few more Zippo-developed games before they disappear in 1991. So the whole cart is simply 2 rather boring minigame collections. Even little kids would be bored by these things as far as I can tell. What exactly was the age group these were aimed at? Preschoolers? The Letter Go Round game simply involves determining if 2 letters are the same. That isn't really teaching kids what the letters are, or what they're called, or what they sound like. Instead, it's just, can you tell the difference between 2 differently shaped letters? And the back of the box art claims that the bathtub game is a problem-solving and predicting game, and will introduce quote-unquote the concepts of cause and effect and spatial relationships. I mean, seriously, if your kid does not have a basic grasp of cause and effect, then how the hell are they even going to use the damn controller? I mean, the game is relatively slick-looking, but ultimately pretty worthless, even for an educational game. Hi-Tech eventually combined both 1, 2, 3, and ABC into one cart and released it in 1991, or thereabouts. They released a couple more Sesame Street games, but those did not involve either Rare or Zippo. There are more games, and better games, that came out for the Western market in September, but we can't cover them all today. So we'll do just one last non-Japanese game, and then cover the rest next time. So, Mattel makes its triumphant return to video games with Bad Street Brawler. This title screen is probably the coolest part of the game. So Bad Street Brawler, and it's not really clear whether this takes place on Bad Street, or if the game is just being completely honest about its quality. Here we have the brawler's famous epigram, "Never trouble trouble till trouble troubles you." You can practice your 3 moves here. You start off with a punch, kick, and a powerful ear pull. Now, Mattel was a major US toy company, and they had previously had their own game console, the Intellivision, which was pretty much dead and gone by the time the Nintendo Entertainment System came out. Bad Street Brawler marked Mattel's return to the world of video games, and was released in conjunction with a certain infamous controller, the Power Glove. Now, the Power Glove is rightly remembered as not being a very good controller, but the idea, I guess, was pretty amazing when you think about it. Virtual reality and cyberspace were pretty hot concepts at the time, with a key piece of equipment in virtual reality being some sort of glove that you could use to manipulate virtual objects with. The Power Glove was distributed in the US by Mattel, but was created by a company called Abrams Gentle Entertainment, run by some film and TV veterans, and is basically a dummied-down version of the Data Glove, a much more high-tech device created by Jason Lanier, one of the big shots in the world of virtual reality. In fact, he reportedly even popularized the term virtual reality. Years later, Abrams Gentle came out with a very similar glove-shaped controller called the P5. Now, while the Power Glove could be programmed to work, sort of, with many games, there were only 2 games specifically designed to work with it: Bad Street Brawler and Super Glove Ball, also by Mattel. And there were also a few games that were announced and never released. Footage for one of these games, called Tech Town, even exists in this videotape.
Travel through time and space, literally grabbing the tools you need in pursuit of the next challenge. No one has 3D moves like...
Of course, Bad Street Brawler can be played with just, regular control pad as well. I really don't think the Power Glove makes this game any better, though. It's a very simple walk left to right beat 'em up with 15 short levels. You fight a few small groups of enemies, then reach a boss type fight thing, which is often just a regular enemy or 2. There are usually 3 bosses per level, and the last one is usually a new enemy type. Here it's a gorilla, which can be easily destroyed by using the ear pull. That's right, you defeat a giant gorilla simply by pulling on its ear. Between levels, you throw out any of the enemy's weapons that you manage to catch, including, hilariously, the gorilla's bananas. I mean, they're just bananas. I can understand getting rid of the knives and clubs and things, but why bananas? Bad Street Brawler is a weirdly unbalanced game. The attacks that you have change every round, and some attacks are way too powerful, like the quote-unquote trip attack, which really looks more like you're sort of pushing someone on the ground and sort of rubbing them. And the developers even sort of acknowledge this, because when you use the trip attack on one of these dogs, it looks like you're rubbing his tummy and you actually say, "Nice boy," as if you were petting him. One really odd design decision was that you can avoid almost all the fights except the boss fights. In most cases, you can simply run away from the enemies until you reach the boss. They'll usually sort of chase after you and then turn around and disappear once you reach the boss area. Combat is pretty simple, and it's mostly just a matter of timing. You'll often find a poorly timed attack passing harmlessly through the enemies, and enemies will often pass right through you without doing damage as well. Now, there are a few in-between level rewards like this. Like many Western NES games, there are some boobs tossed in, as well as some crude sexual innuendo. with the reporter sort of symbolically giving him a hand job here. You may have noticed on the title screen, the developer was Beam Software, the Australian company who was also involved with the US version of the Airwolf game. This is actually a port of a computer game, first released in 1987. In different territories it was called either Bad Street Brawler, Bop and Rumble, or Street Hassle. The title screens all have these sort of slightly different versions of the artwork, but they all share an excess of nipples drawn onto the characters, in particular the gorilla. This is the DOS version. These guys with canes don't really appear until much later in the NES game, but they appear in the first level of the computer version. The moves have been changed around quite a bit as well, and the trip attack, when used on these little old ladies, oh man. Also, your character here looks a lot more like a pro wrestler or something. In the NES version, his name is given as Duke Davis, and is described as a former punk rocker turned vigilante. He bears an interesting resemblance to Duke Nukem, who would of course get his first game in 1991. Bad Street Brawler is not a very well regarded game. Sean maybe put it on both his worst NES games list and his worst video games of all time list, and while it's really not that bad, it is pretty awful. It's extremely linear, very repetitive, and kind of alternates between being too easy and stupidly cheap. And this is basically exactly what it looks like, an ugly port of a lame old computer game. Alright, we're back to Japan in September 1989. Here's a good one, a fantastically weird game from Coconuts Japan and the mysterious Sea Dream, who, as I've mentioned before, have no relation to the American company Color Dreams, I'm sure. American Dream is a pretty strange game, so thank goodness we have an unofficial translation from one Pale Dim. Yep, that's Pachio-kun. American Dream is the third game from Coconuts featuring the lovable anthropomorphized pachinko ball, Pachio-kun, and he's going to Brooklyn. It's just like the Eddie Murphy movie Coming to America, but it's all gambling based. And you fly from Tokyo to New York in a helicopter. Pretty sure that's not possible. That would certainly take a really long time. We actually have a somewhat accurate map of New York here. So American Dream is a Dragon Quest inspired game, but with gambling. And it's not really an RPG, it just sort of takes the Dragon Quest template and removes the actual RPG stuff. We've seen a tennis RPG, a racing RPG, so why not a gambling RPG? Now as we can see here, there are actually random battles on the world map, but they really aren't important. You can make or lose a bit of money, but 99% of the action is in the casinos. Now you'll first need a pass to get into a casino, because I guess these casinos are very exclusive and picky as to who walks in there and starts losing money. Once inside, you exchange some money for chips and start playing slots. $1 slots are the cheapest, but you will find pricier games upstairs. Now the object of American Dream is simply to make money. Well, I guess it's actually to sort of conquer America through massive slot machine winnings. Specifically, you need to get enough money to travel to the next borough, and then you play more slots and then repeat. So the first step is to make enough money until you can go to Queens. Now, why would you want to go to Queens if you're already in Brooklyn? I don't know. But remember back when this came out, Brooklyn was not some hip, trendy place. It was more of sort of like a rough and tumble working class area where everyone spoke like stereotypical New York cab drivers. Before you leave, you'll want to find the invisible VIP card, which is just lying around on the ground in some random place. Once you have enough cash, you wander over to this thing. It looks like the Washington Square Arch, but it's actually the gateway to Queens, and it's called the Rainbow Bridge. And it is literally a rainbow bridge, like the bridge to Asgard. Now there is a famous rainbow bridge in Tokyo, though it's just a regular bridge not made of rainbows. But why they inserted it into this game is anyone's guess. And why the hell is the toll so high? So aside from the slot machines, various events can take place. If you enter this casino, you'll find out it's haunted, or something, and you have to play this silly little guessing game to get out. Another casino is crooked, and if you enter it, they'll actually sort of toss you over these mountains back into Brooklyn. So after Queens, you need to make enough money to get into the Bronx, then Manhattan, and all through like a rather sort of lengthy circular route. If only there were some sort of free public bridge connecting Manhattan and Brooklyn. Oh well. After conquering the casinos in Manhattan, logically the final area would be Staten Island, right? Nope, Staten Island gets no love. Instead you go on to New Jersey, which kind of makes sense because in the real world there's actual gambling there, unlike in New York where it's illegal. In fact, I'd say part or most of the appeal of American Dream is actually just how utterly ridiculous its depiction of New York is. I mean, yeah, sure, it's pretty silly. New York is a bunch of open fields with occasional skyscrapers and enormous casinos dotting the landscape. Sort of this whole sort of goofy take on America and American materialism. It's intriguing, but just realize that if you actually try to play American Dream, you'll be spending pretty much all your time pulling a slot machine handle over and over again. So don't expect to get that much entertainment out of this game. There were actually several games released in Japan on September 29th, so we'll only be able to cover some of them today and then the rest next time. Here though, we have Akuma no Shochaijo, or Devil's Imitation, published by Kemco, though you'll notice the name ICOM on the title screen. Now this is a point-and-click adventure game, and as many of you will have figured out, this is the game known in the US as Uninvited. It's kind of funny they call this Devil's Imitation in Japan and put an image of an imitation on the title screen, which is sort of a weird bit of irony in the US version because the name is Uninvited and they are showing an imitation. The game starts a lot like ICOM's Deja Vu, sort of begins in media res. You've just crashed your car into a tree and your sister is missing. You can see how the game controls in this screen. There's a large inventory menu on the right hand side. Below that is sort of a menu that allows you to sort of go through the pages of your inventory, among other things. In the bottom menu you have your commands, and in the lower left there's a mini-map. And the upper left, of course, is the window that shows you what you're looking at. The style of Uninvited will be familiar to us since we've already seen Deja Vu and Shadowgate. Those were the other two games in this series, and as you recall, those titles were actually sort of pioneering point-and-click adventure games, originally released on the Macintosh by ICOM. You'd probably consider the original computer versions to be superior to this. The Mac version of Uninvited was released in 1986, and the black and white graphics were much more high resolution than the Famicom version. And of course these things were originally designed to be played with a mouse, so the interface is much easier to use. Now just a reminder, the order that we're seeing these games in is not the order they were originally created in. On the Mac, Deja Vu came first, followed by Uninvited, and finally Shadowgate. On the Japanese Famicom, the release order was Deja Vu, Shadowgate, and finally Uninvited. And in the US, we had Shadowgate, then Deja Vu, and finally Uninvited. This starts sort of like its successor game, Shadowgate, in that your first challenge is simply to try to get into the house. You probably will think to open the envelope and find a letter addressed to a Master Crowley. It's a not very subtle reference to Aleister Crowley, and you also get some background information about the mystic shit and the undead and whatever the hell is going on here. This also introduces you to the game's sort of unlogical puzzles. I mean, the house seems to be locked up tighter than a drum, and there's no keys to be found. But when you take the pendant out of the envelope, suddenly that magically unlocks the house. Uninvited feels kind of like a dry run for Shadowgate. The environments are quite similar. Instead of a castle, you're in a haunted house. You spend most of your time opening doors and boxes and picking up things, and avoiding the occasional monster. Just like Shadowgate, dangers must be avoided in very specific fashions. The first ghost you encounter is this one, featured on the US box art. Once she appears, if you interact with her or even try opening a door, this will result in instant death. Now, of course, in a nearby room, you'll find a bottle of No Ghost. However, you can't just, click Use and use it on her. No, you have to open the bottle first before you attempt to use it. Otherwise, you'll die. There's quite a few ways to die in this game, and much of the charm of Uninvited is sort of the gruesome death scenes that you get. I mean, there's nothing here as annoying as tripping and dying in the dark like it was in Shadowgate. But one really awful thing in Uninvited is the ruby. You will find tons of items you can pick up, many of which do absolutely nothing, but you should pick up anyway, just in case it comes out useful later. One thing you will find is the ruby, and Uninvited gives you no hints whatsoever about not touching this, but the ruby will kill you if you hang on to it for too long. And the game doesn't even tell you why you died. It doesn't say it's because you picked up the ruby. Now, of course, everyone knows this nowadays, but back then, when the game first came out, this seemed quite cruel. The house isn't really too huge. There's an upstairs and a downstairs, some rooms to the sides, there's a kitchen, a game room, and then there's a backyard area with 3 more buildings. Solutions to the puzzles, as I mentioned, can be somewhat obscure, like throwing a box into the fireplace. It seems like a bad idea, but when the box burns up, it allows you to get the apparently fireproof item that was inside the box. Now, it should be pointed out there's a speak command, but you don't actually talk to anyone like you do in many of the Japanese adventure games we've seen. Instead, you use speak to utter spells, such as a thunder spell to scare away these dogs. If you try to attack them or interact with them any other way, they will kill you. Near the game's end, you'll find an underground maze, which is filled with, among other things, this ridiculous 3-animal puzzle. Though I do love this death scene. The object here is to get the bird. Why? Well, it's for when you encounter this weird guy. What exactly is this? Looks like something from a Little Feat album cover. For some reason, he runs away after the bird if you release the bird. Again, not the most logical thing to do. At the bottom of the maze, you'll find this frozen cave, and some dude, who I think is Master Crowley? He explains that he has put Drakon, that's the bad guy, into some sort of suspended animation by freezing him, and he needs you to throw his body down the well, a well which leads to the quote-unquote Dark World. And this ending is pretty weird. I mean, you see Drakon's frozen body just lying there. Trying to interact with him will cause him to wake up. Instead of doing this, you'd actually, quote-unquote, use his body on the pit. This allows you to throw him down the pit and finishes him off, and suddenly a convenient nearby door will take you back into the house. Now, the actual reason you entered the house to begin with was to look for your sister, and you've pretty much forgotten about her until now. The game makes very few references to her after you enter the house. It's all about avoiding ghosts and trying to figure out what's going on with this Drakon guy. But then you suddenly hear her voice, and eventually you'll find her in this little doorless room. I'm not sure how she got in there. Did ghosts lock her up in there or something? But she's possessed. Nothing a little slap can't cure. And your final action will be to throw holy water at this guy. Naturally, your sister doesn't even know what happened, that silly girl. The end. So yeah, Uninvited's a well-done port of a sort of classic game that hasn't really aged that well, but it's still reasonably fun to play if you have the patience. And that wraps up Kemco's series of Mac Venture games. Last game this episode, hooray! This is Tonjan, or as it's sometimes called, Ochin no Toshi Puzzle Tonjan. Meaning something about dropping things down holes, puzzle, and pigs. Published by Jalico, it has NMK's name in the title screen, NMK having already been involved with a few other Jalico cartridges, such as one of the Ninja-kun games. Alright, so we have a very cute little title screen here involving pigs, which are filthy, non-cute creatures in real life. Now, don't panic, this isn't a Mahjong game. It's a puzzle game that uses Mahjong tiles. It's really just one of the very many Sokoban-like games that came out around this time. You push around blocks, or Mahjong tiles in this case. Those white circles are, well, I don't know exactly what they are. Portals, maybe? Holes? You push the tiles into them and then the tiles disappear. Now there's a certain order you want to push them in. See that tile up there at the very top? That's the tile that clears the level. You want to push that in last. To the side we see a tile that gives you double points, and below that there's a tile that sort of gives you like some bonus points. You want to push in the tile that doubles your points as soon as possible. So the idea is simply push everything into the holes as efficiently as possible while maximizing your points. After each level you get a rating. As it turns out, Tonjan wasn't the first pig game from NMK and Jalico. No, that was this game, simply called Pig in Japan, or Budasan, or Pigs and Bombers. It was about, well, pigs throwing bombs at each other. It actually got ported to some home computer systems as well. Tonjan, the quasi-sequel, was intended as an arcade game, but was never actually released. As far as I can tell, Jalico or NMK ended up selling this to a Korean company called Duyong, who released it in 1990 with altered graphics as Yam Yam. The overall gameplay is the same, though the pig has been replaced with a tanuki. So that's pretty much Tonjan in a nutshell. Later levels add more elements and trickier puzzles. You have two ways of pushing tiles. One space at a time, or pushing them so that they all slide as far as they can. Be careful not to mix the two buttons up and push the tiles too far. You're actually able to die in this game. Those fish tiles can't be pushed into the portals, otherwise you'll lose the level and start over. I'm not sure there's any sort of logical in-game explanation for this, or for that matter, why you're pushing Mahjong tiles into holes at all. So if you're a fan of semi-decent Sokoban variations, I guess, congratulations, here's a new one for you. Alright, there we have it. What a horrible collection of games. What do I even choose for the best game this episode? Maybe nothing? I suppose I could pick either Ultima, Quest of the Avatar, or Uninvited. I mean, those are certainly the most well-remembered games featured this episode, though that's almost kind of a cheat because both were ports of earlier computer games, and both have a lot of elements today that are kind of frustrating. I'm not really sure how playable they still are. I kind of wish I could cheat and pick Final Fight or Strider from the Arcade Roundup, but, that would be cheating. So maybe Uninvited? At least it has some sort of iconic imagery and artwork, if nothing else. And the worst? Again, I don't know. Nothing is quite outright Kasuge. I mean, Hollywood Squares and Sesame Street 1, 2, 3 are completely worthless, quickie titles pumped out with very little thought. Maybe I'll give the worst award to Bad Street Brawler. I mean, everything about this game screams, we don't give a shit. from the inconsistent character design to the completely thoughtless level design and the weirdly varying difficulty between levels. And yet, it's weird enough that it almost becomes kind of a minor trash classic. Either way, these 3 games were all either British or Australian, so we sort of get a good picture of the horrible video games being produced in the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. Now next up is some Chronturbo and Chron-Sega, but as for Chrontendo 49, we've got another infamous game from the makers of Bad Street Brawler, and we have some more rare developed titles, another Nintendo adventure game, and we have a shooter from Konami, and we actually have a title that I'm looking forward to, a classic game from Capcom based on a popular TV show. Things are definitely looking up for next time. Between now and then, I suggest you keep an eye on the Chrontendo Tumblr. And yes, there is a Chrontendo Tumblr, mostly just used for posting screenshots, but I'm going to start putting up sort of like micro updates on Tumblr. As I sort of make progress on the new episodes, I'll keep you filled in via, the occasional post. Nothing too detailed. It's more intended to let people know that, how the episodes are progressing and to assure everyone that I'm not dead or kidnapped by terrorists or something like that. And if you have not seen the Chrontendo Tumblr, well, it's not hard to find. It's simply called Chrontendo. You can look it up. Alright, see you later.